Hello and welcome to our second kind of supplemental episode, or our second episode of the Two's Complement series. My name is your host, whatever you want to call me, go for it. In this series, we are going to work through the translation of the One Lone Coder's Pixel game engine from C++ to C#. A big thank you to JavaX9 and his One Lone Coder project for allowing the use of the Pixel game engine for this purpose. While this project is not endorsed or supported by, the One Lone Coder projects, he did kind of graciously give us the permission to use his code for this purpose. And, huge thank you for that. So links to his content will be in the description box, as well as on the YouTube, the GitHub channel that has the code for this project. Before I start releasing the videos and working really kind of diving into the translation itself, I wanted to give a quick overview of the Pixel game engine kind of structure and talk a little bit about how the scheduling is going to work and kind of what we're going to be working through. Now, our core goal is to work through the entirety of the main Pixel game engine header file that contains the core functionality for the Pixel game engine. Once that's done, we will probably also start working on the extension methods, but it's going to depend pretty heavily on the time it takes to get through the engine itself and kind of how I'm feeling at the end of that, if I'm burnt out or not. I imagine at some point, though, I will get to those extension methods. So with that said, the main focus being on the primary header file that contains the core Pixel game engine. We need to understand kind of what that file looks like, how it's separated, and a little bit of how the hierarchy or the file structure looks. And this is an important step of any software translation project. Understanding how the library or how the application works from the ground up. So that way, as you are doing your translations and as you are kind of working through and rewriting this code, you have an understanding of, where all the pieces need to fit. If you don't have that as you're going in, you might end up making decisions and cutting corners that kind of, bite you in the butt later on, and you can accrue technical debt without even realizing that you're doing it. As an example, as we'll talk about here in a second, one of the foundational classes of the Pixel game engine is the Pixel class. And if we try to cut some corners with the Pixel class, and maybe we try to not use certain, overload some of the operators, or we try not to, or maybe we just kind of flub some of the methods in that class early on, we might find that later, once we go to implement our sprite class, it might rely on that Pixel class behaving in a certain way. And if we haven't built our Pixel class correctly, we're going to have to go back and kind of do more edits to it after we're finished. And that's something that we're trying to avoid. We don't want to be redoing work or reopening work that we've already done. So that's, it's important to understand, at least at a high level, what it is that you're going to be doing. Now, that isn't to say that you need to have a 100% understanding of every single line of code. You're not going to have that, and you probably, it's probably a little bit excessive to have that before you start. Because if you try to spend a bunch of time understanding everything, you're never going to get started, or you're going to be sitting here for weeks, trying to do too much without making any real progress. And you're going to get defeated, and you're going to end up, stopping the project before you ever get started. And that's not something that you want to happen. And if it's something you're doing for work, obviously that's not, you can't just say, you can't show no progress for weeks on end. At least most of us can't. So with all that said, let's now that we have an understanding of why we want to go through this, let's kind of talk about how the Pixel game engine itself is structured. And the way I have this kind of laid out here on screen is kind of from the top down. This first layer is the highest level, most complex object that is kind of dependent on all the layers beneath it. Right? So at the highest level, we have the Pixel game engine core class itself. And this class has, definitions for things like creating windows, drawing objects to screens, loading resources, creating the renderer, doing some platform specific functionality, all kinds of stuff, setting up configurations. This is our high level class. And we can't get to doing the translations for this class if we don't have all those building blocks in place. So as we kind of go down, from this level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, we kind of get an idea of where we need to start. When we start our translations, we kind of need to start at this bottom level, or at least, actually, we don't actually really need to start at level 5. We can do this as we go. Probably level 4 is where we really need to start, but we'll talk about that in a sec. So we need to basically build this from the ground up. We can't start at the highest level and build in a, quote, top-down order, because we won't have so many things implemented and we won't have a good understanding of why things are built the way they are. So this structure that I have laid out is also kind of the order that we're going to be approaching the translation for the Pixel game engine, starting from, these levels 4 and 5 and working our way up. So let me just start at the bottom, and we'll real quick talk about each of these levels and kind of what they're built in. And then we'll talk a little bit about these kind of boxes on the side. So at the lowest level, we have like our enums. We have a couple of like specific definitions. We have some helper classes and extension classes. Now, these are not really any classes that are doing a bunch that they don't have functionality in and of themselves. And this might also have like a configuration class built or configuration object as well. So none of these really have a bunch of functionality. These are really helping us. These are really here to help us fill out information in other classes. So we will create these as we see them and as we run into them, but we don't really need to spend a whole bunch of time on this section, worrying about every single thing here before we kind of move up to the next thing. And additionally, there's nothing in this level that is really too complex to translate. When you're talking about things like enums, there's really only, it's really just copying the values over into a similar structure. Now, C# has an enum class, or an enum type, so we can just use that. I think we might not even show any of this stuff, right? Like there's not really anything complex here. Maybe we'll do like one, quick 2 or 3 or 5 minute episode talking about, how we're translating enums, how we're doing some of the helper and extension methods if they're needed. If there's any like special includes that we need, this is going to be very quick. On top of that, this is where we have kind of our first foundational classes, in our, our layer 4 things is where we start getting to our foundational stuff. So we have our resource pack and our resource loaders. This is really how we are saving our, our sprites, how we're saving maybe our object data and other, kind of data objects to disk, how we're storing those, how we're loading those, and how we're structuring that kind of file system on disk, prior to our game being loaded. So obviously that's kind of like a core thing that we're going to need is saving and loading of our resources to disk is going to be extremely important. So so our resource packs and resource loaders are going to be some of the early things. Then we come to our pixel class. Our pixel class is really the core class of this engine for everything that's being displayed on screen. It's not a super complex class, but it's probably going to be one of the first things that we really have a video on and really kind of dive into. There's some cool things here, and it's really important for our sprites and decals later on, and for the pixel, and for our game engine itself. So this is going to be something that we're spending more time on. Next, we have like an enum and a very small kind of helper class. Really, this R code and the hardware button class could probably be in our, these two things are probably part of like our layer 5 objects. They're just referenced a little bit more frequently. So we'll talk a little bit about these. Maybe this is how we'll tie into our layer 5 objects is kind of talking about these two classes. There's nothing too exciting here. Next is our layer 3 stuff, and this is where we kind of really start getting into the meat of the Pixel game engine. We have like our sprites, and our sprites are going to basically build on everything in layer 4. They're going to be really tied into our resource pack. They're going to be tied into our loaders. They're going to be built from our pixels. They're going to rely on having like some of our enums created so that way we have our loading statuses and whatnot built. And decals go hand in hand. They're kind of like you can think of decals as like a special sprite or a special renderable type of image that doesn't necessarily fall into, kind of a sprite object, but is very similar. So our sprites and our decals are going to be like kind of our main image display options or objects, I mean. So these are going to really kind of be core to our kind of intermediate level stuff that we're getting into our translation. And same thing with our kind of layer and our layer descriptions. Like layers, from what I can tell, are just combinations of objects, and they're just used for like, obviously a background layer, foreground, and things like that. So layering objects on top of each other. And so this is going to be, it seems to be a smaller class, but it's still going to be a little bit important to have our core classes built when we get to this. And next we have this kind of generic vector 2D class. This is kind of like in a, layer 3.5 section. And I'll talk about this. We'll probably have a video maybe dedicated to how we're going to handle like this vector 2D generic class. But it's something that is referenced quite frequently, especially when we're talking about window sizes and sprite sizes and things like that. So this is kind of like an adjacent, this is kind of adjacent to layer 3 and layer 4 and, layer 2 and 1. So this is kind of a special class that we're probably going to need to dedicate some time to thinking about before we kind of move up. Next, we have our platform and renderer classes. The renderer is essentially, as it sounds, it's kind of where we're actually drawing stuff to the screen, whether it's text, whether it's our sprites, decals, and handling all of our layer objects. Platform seems to be some platform-specific stuff. I'm not. So these are going to be really kind of, I don't want to try to say how much time we're going to spend on things, but our renderer and our platform, sections are probably going to take as much time as our layer 3 and 4 videos combined, if not more. And then our pixel game engine class translation is going to probably take as much time as every layer below it combined. Just looking at, how much stuff is involved in the implementation for these things. So, these are going to be some of the much later objects that we are going to actually have videos on and talk about and work through. And this is where we're going to start getting into complexities. And, this is also where, especially like this is also where we might run into some cross-platform support things that we might actually put on the back burner and come back to, because we are writing this in C#, and yes, C# is cross-platform now. I am, primarily a Windows user. I'm kind of doing this project for my own use first and foremost. So I might focus on the Windows implementation and try to trim this down a little bit. So that way we're not focusing too much on the cross-platform work. And then finally we have, the real, probably 50% of our time is going to be spent on it. And that's the translation and the work on the pixel game engine classes itself. Looking at this, there is quite a lot of code that we should be able to reuse when we're talking about kind of drawing objects to screen. But this is also like where we get into some real kind of tricky stuff, and we get into graphics processing, things that we need to consider. We get into like dealing with graphics libraries that we want to try to support. So this is where we're going to get into the real kind of long-term, future of the series. There's going to be a lot of work put into this kind of final structure. And I touched on this cross-platform bit. So this cross-platform code is going to be kind of hit and miss, and it's going to depend on the complexity and the time sink to do the cross-platform support. I'm not going to rule it out entirely, but I'm also not going to say, yes, we're doing cross-platform support right off the bat. It's really going to depend on again, like the time and effort it takes to go through it. And finally, we have engine extensions. And there's quite a number of extension classes and extension headers that can be, added on, especially with like sound, which is kind of important for games. So these are definitely things that we're going to look into in the future. I don't know how many of these, or if we're going to do all of these. It's really going to be depending on kind of where my motivation is at, if I'm burnt out or not. But it's something that, to consider. There are engine extensions outside of the kind of core Pixel game engine header that we will probably want to bring into play at some point in the future. So that's our roadmap, and that's kind of our timeline for this series. Again, we're going to try to work our way up. Our first videos are probably going to be on the Pixel class and then the resource pack and the resource loaders, and then we'll kind of build from there. So, apologies that, we haven't actually seen any code yet. Obviously this is still kind of in the very infancy of this series and this translation, and the first time I've done something like this. So please, I welcome your feedback. So thank you for your time. Keep an eye out for, the videos in the future. And again, big shout out and thank you to Javid and the One Lone Coder Project. Be sure to check out his stuff. Have a good one.